Welcome to Human Rights International Lesson 6. Today we're going to talk about modern slavery. Once again, I will present the lesson in the same way that you could present your essay, just to give you an example of how it can be done. So, what is modern slavery? Well, many of the products we use every day are products of slave labour or child labour. Basically, modern slavery is the exploitation of people for personal, commercial gain. It's all around us. It's in our electronics, in our phones, in chocolate, in coffee. But because sometimes it's buried a long way down in the supply chain, we don't take much notice of it. It's almost certainly in one article of clothing that you are wearing at the moment. The website antislavery.org estimates that there are 40 million people in modern slavery, which is a lot of people. Many of those people come from third world countries and earn as much as $1 a day for working 12 to 16-hour days. Companies like Apple, Nike, and other large companies are involved in having some sort of slave labour in their supply chain. There is an explanation, a better explanation of modern slavery in the link below. So, modern slavery breaches many human rights. But when you want to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are two rights that are directly involved in modern slavery, and they're being breached. And the first one is freedom from slavery, and that's Article 4, and Article 23, the right to work. Freedom from slavery applies because many people working under these conditions are unable to leave. Sometimes they have their passports taken. Sometimes poverty forces them to stay in unacceptable conditions. Article 23 is not only the right to work, but the right to fair compensation for work and for safe and healthy workplaces. Many of the places in the factories where people work making clothing for large companies are not safe, and there is no representation of the workers within those workplaces. So these two articles are two of the major articles being breached by modern slavery. There are several other conventions and UN documents that are being breached when we talk about this issue. However, a lot of modern slavery involves child labour, and the UN has a convention on the rights of the child. And in particular, this convention says that children have the right to be protected from work that harms them and is bad for their health and education. And if you work, you have the right to be safe and paid fairly. That's Article 32. Many factories and many companies who employ children do not pay them fairly, and they employ them in unsafe conditions. It also, Article 36 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child also applies, which is that you have the right to protection from any kind of exploitation. Obviously, child labour for very young children is exploitation. This doesn't mean that all child labour, because the definition of a child under the Convention is under the age of 18, and as many of you probably have, you worked at age 15, 16, which is completely legal in Australia. I did, and many people do. And of course, if you're being fairly compensated and you're in a workplace that is safe and healthy for you, you are not being exploited and you are not having your rights breached. Now, there are many impacts of modern slavery. Estimated at many millions of people are in modern slavery, and 70% of those workers are working in hazardous conditions. That's for child labour. Of course, the impact of children is that they are prevented from being educated, and their health is impacted. and their prospects for the future, and their lives are basically cut short. There's also the matter of exploited labour in the clothing industry, and this very good documentary, The True Cost, actually talks about the impact of exploited labour in the clothing industry, particularly in Bangladesh. A few years ago, there were the buildings in which many women worked to produce clothing for major companies like H&M. The buildings collapsed and they killed many women, and that is actually discussed in this documentary. Basically, most of these workplaces, particularly in places like Bangladesh, are unhealthy, they're unsafe, they can kill people, the women get beaten up, and of course the wages are slave wages. So the impact on the communities can be terrible. Now, there have been many responses to the issue of slave labour. Some of those responses come from non-government organisations and non-profit organisations. In Australia, the Walk Free Foundation, which is part of the Minderoo Foundation, which is founded by Twiggy Forrest, who is a major mining billionaire in Australia. They produce what's called the Global Slavery Index, and they also lobbied the Australian government to legislate a Modern Slavery Act, and they were successful in that. Shop Ethical produces the Ethical Consumer Guide, which I recommend you have a look at. These are two examples of non-profit organisations which are taking steps to lobby governments and produce information about modern slavery and to try and influence people's behaviour and responses to modern slavery. Governments and UN organisations also take action to prevent child labour and modern slavery. So the ILO is the International Labour Organization, and it has a program called Enhance, which is based in Vietnam, and they step in directly to provide education for children who have been in child labour situations. The Australian government has acted by producing the Modern Slavery Act, and there are similar acts in many countries around the world. The Modern Slavery Act was legislated in 2018 and promulgated in 2019, and it requires businesses and other organisations above a certain size to report annually on the risks of modern slavery in their operations and supply chains, and the action they have taken to assess and address those risks and the effectiveness of their responses. Many businesses have also responded to the issue of modern slavery by producing modern slavery statements. And for example, Google has a transparent statement that you can look up at this link online. The Google statement is interesting because in that statement they rely on the businesses themselves to self-audit whether they are meeting Google modern slavery guidelines, which is very interesting. The tech industry in particular is susceptible to having slavery in its supply chains, particularly because many gadgets rely on certain minerals to run, and these minerals are often mined under slave labour conditions, particularly in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, there have actually been substantial arguments in favour of sweatshops and what we would call modern slavery. And there are people who have written articles and academic articles about modern slavery. In particular, in the book, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Rudin have written an article for the New York Times called 2 Cheers for Sweatshops, which is a very famous article. In this article, they argue that sweatshops provide a path to prosperity for the workers and an escape from poverty. They cite an example where a father is proud that his child is working in a factory, in a sweatshop. Basically, their argument is that sweatshops are providing work and employment for people in third world countries to rise out of poverty and become the new middle class. They don't talk a lot about the terrible conditions they have to survive to actually become part of the new middle class. Obviously, the arguments against sweatshops are that conditions in sweatshops are terrible and dangerous and they threaten people's lives. The workers are exploited with no health or safety regulation or any representation in the workplace. The pay is pitiful and there is no reason for these conditions except excessive profits. Conditions could improve with little effect on the profit of large organisations and large companies. Finally, I suggest that you do an experiment on items in your own home and use the websites ethical.org.au or Products of Slavery to check your items. And you should look at the item, look at the company that makes it, the country where it came from, and have a look and see whether it could possibly be a product of slavery. You might be surprised at what you find. So in conclusion, this lesson has basically presented the issue of modern slavery in a format that you could use for your essay. Firstly, we defined the issue of modern slavery. What is modern slavery? We related the issue of modern slavery to articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in other UN documents such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I talked about the impact on communities, on how it affects children, and how it affects workers. And I also talked about the responses of NGOs, governments, and businesses such as Google. So if you were going to write an article about modern slavery, you could actually use all the information in this particular presentation and you could use it as the basis of your essay. All you would have to do is add an introduction and conclusion. And if you wanted to write an opinion, you could. So I hope that gave you an idea about the issue of modern slavery and also a bit of a structure on how you could write your essay for the Human Rights Assessment 2. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.